I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose land UNSW is built, and that's the Bidjigal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the room here tonight or watching online. And we do have more than 75 people watching online, so you might feel like there's not a lot of you here, but there will be. There are many people who are participating here. I'd also like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people's ongoing stewardship over land, sea and air. Now, today's panel is being delivered as part of the new UNSW Community of Practice for Inclusive Research with queer and trans people and people with variations of sex characteristics, who are sometimes called intersex people. This community of practice comprises UNSW academic and professional staff and research students, both LGBTQIA+ and allies, who hold particular expertise and interest in making research and other engagement and collaboration practices with queer, trans and intersex people more inclusive. We'd like to thank the Division of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion for helping us to establish this, and to the Diversity Fest program for including this event. This is the first event of the new community of practice, and we call ourselves COPCUTI for short. We look forward to increasing the diversity of perspectives as we continue to develop our planning. We have some amazing speakers, but they of course do not represent all of the amazing advocacy and activist work across so-called Australia. So watch this space as we strive toward ever greater inclusivity in the future. And can I just point out that all of our First Nations colleagues are a little bit busy right now. So now let me turn to tonight's event, which focuses on a number of recent wins for LGBTQIA+ rights in Australia and go beyond marriage equality. Marriage equality was a huge public victory, but there's so much more legal reform needed to ensure that LGBTQIA+ people can participate more fully in Australian society. And so with that in mind, I'm going to introduce our amazing panellists who are playing a key role in advocating and making these changes across Tasmania, Queensland, and of course, New South Wales. I'll start with our live person, Alex Greenwich. Now, I reckon you've probably heard of him. Alex Greenwich MP is the independent member for Sydney in the New South Wales Parliament. Alex was first elected in 2012 and he's the chair of the Legislative Assembly's Committee on Parliamentary Privilege and Ethics, and he's a member of the Speakers panel. Alex, famously, was the co-chair of the successful Yes campaign that delivered marriage equality in 2017, a movement he has led for over a decade, and he's also co-authored the book Yes, 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 Australia's Journey to Marriage Equality. In 2019, Alex introduced the co-sponsored Reproductive Healthcare Reform Bill, which decriminalised abortion in New South Wales. In May 2022, his 2021 co-sponsored, he co-sponsored the Voluntary Assisted Dying Bill passed by the New South Wales Parliament, providing hope and choice for terminally ill people in New South Wales. Alex recently introduced his Equality Bill that will remove LGBTQIA+ discrimination from New South Wales law. I'll also introduce our two online panellists tonight. On the right-hand side here, we have Jess Cunning, and her pronouns are she, her. Jess is the General Counsel and Company Secretary at Titles Queensland and has worked in the legal profession for over 15 years. She has broad experience across a range of commercial, property and construction matters in private practice and in-house roles, including owning her own practice. Jess is a mum to 2 daughters, an umpire in the QAFL, the treasurer of the LGBTI Legal Service in Brisbane, and has previously served on several boards and worked with other organisations and charities, including as a director and secretary of Trans Pride Australia. Jess also speaks about her lived experience and gives her time, expertise and voice to causes that work to make the world a kinder and safer place, particularly for marginalised and vulnerable people. And finally, we have Ash. They, them, directly above me here. Ash is a person of action. After being nominated to the board of Equality Tasmania last year, Ash immediately set about leading awareness and advocacy campaigns in line with their lived experience of trans and asexual, aromantic spectrum issues, and supported the organisation's efforts in other areas. Their day job, working for a peak body, complements their labour of passion perfectly. So, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to sit down now so we can be a little bit more comfortable. In July this year, we heard that Tasmania is now the first state to officially recognise LGBTQIA+. A represents asexual, romantic and agender people, but often left off the acronym. Tell us why it is important to recognise the A, and how did you make this happen?
Yeah, thank you so much. So it happened, it really started with the community expressing a need and expressing that they weren't being recognised. And when I say they, I of course mean we as a member of the community. So we know that ASPEC folks in Tasmania aren't currently, don't currently have explicit protection from the Anti-Discrimination Act. But there's also some other, I guess, inconsistencies that we've noticed in Tasmania prior to our work. The A wasn't consistently used in the acronym. So like we soon found all states across Australia and indeed federally, it was a little bit haphazard. Some bodies, some departments, some organisations would include the A and others wouldn't. And we really recognise the need for there to be a consistent message and consistent inclusion for agender, aromantic and asexual people in order to get that recognition out there, get that acknowledgement out there and get that visibility out there. So it first started before I joined the board of Equality Tasmania, and we approached Equality Tasmania approached the whole of government LGBTIQ+ reference group. And at that time, there wasn't any appetite for change. And so ET decided that there needed to be lived experience voice. And that's when myself and a colleague, Sam, came on board as lived experience advocates. And with the lived experience voice, it was a lot easier to convey the importance and the need for change. And it wasn't, I go as far as saying it wasn't nearly as challenging as we thought it would be in this first stage, touch wood. So yeah, why is it important? I see the LGBTIQA+ acronym as a whole bunch of umbrellas. And if there's a group who's not covered under one of those umbrellas, it means they're out in the rain getting wet. So I think that, you know, it's grown and the argument has been that the acronym's getting too long, it's getting unwieldy, why do we need to add more letters? But when there's communities who aren't reasonably visible under one of those existing umbrellas, that's when there needs to be recognition. That's when there needs to be visibility. Otherwise, it's erasure.
Answer, and that was to do. We're now going to turn to Queensland. And Jessica, the Palaszczuk government passed new laws to modernise birth certificates in June, which included, among other changes, trans and gender diverse people no longer being required to undergo sexual reassignment surgery in order to fully recognise or register a change of sex. The different state legislation around these issues can be quite complicated to understand. How did this reform process happen? Can you tell us about your role?
I wish I could say it happened overnight or even a matter of months or some years. It was probably a decade in the making. Well before I got involved in BTI legal service here in Brisbane, it happened with a number of organisations, including the legal service, other organisations here in Brisbane and Queensland, as well as nationally. In about 2019, 2020, so some 4 or 5 years ago, the then Labor government, still Labor government, but important to note, previous political cycle, put a discussion paper out And so those discussions that were happening within advocacy organisations and the legal centres started to turn into a political conversation. The government had a number of discussion papers that came out. I know the LGBTI legal service made 3 submissions in that process. That process didn't go any further until the state election occurred, came into a new cycle. Important to note here in Queensland, we are the only state that doesn't have an upper house. Alex will tell you, changes the political landscape a lot. We simply have one house. That house makes all of the rules. And so we don't ever have any political games being played between the houses. In this election cycle, about 2, maybe 3 years ago, it was put out through the AG's, the Attorney General's office, to discuss what that would look like in amending what is a 20-year-old piece of legislation with a raft of outdated words and requirements to meet the current requirements of the people of Queensland. Why was that important? I think for people of gender, diverse identities, it's important that we, when I say we, are able to enjoy legal capacity in all aspects of our lives without having to undergo invasive surgery, hormone treatment, or any form of sterilisation as a prerequisite to get that legal recognition. Apart from the recognition, rights of equality, importantly, probably a lot of people don't think about or have a lived experience, a right of privacy, obviously applying for jobs, bank accounts, any other time you need to show your birth certificate or the birth certificate of your children, effectively breaches your privacy or things you may not want to discuss with people. Not all trans and gender diverse people want to have surgery either. That's an invasive step that the state have placed on trans and gender diverse people for a very long time to change their birth certificate. So it obviously removes that requirement as well. And apart from just the trans and gender diverse birth certificate changes, there are also a number of changes in relation to that reflect modern families. So same-sex families, rather than having a mother and a parent or a father and a parent, same-sex couples can now register, or will be able to, when the legislation's brought in, mother and mother and father on their children's birth certificates. So yeah, a whole lot of Queenslanders will be impacted by this legislation when it comes in early 2024.
Fantastic, congratulations. And now, Alex, actively tell us.
Yeah.
Or working on in the political sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in New South Wales, we have states and territories. Under the government, we're able to move the so-called gay fund convictions. We're able to establish this into gay hate crime, and we were able to provide some protection to people, variation and sex. Some of that was done well, some of that was done in a bit of but what we have seen is all the other states and territories move forward when it comes to anti-discrimination protections for the LGBTQIA+ community. And so my bill that I have introduced to Parliament already a couple of weeks back basically took 18 months to consult on and draft. We worked with organisations like Equality Australia, who audited some 500 pieces of legislation in New South Wales. And so we've got a piece of legislation, an omnibus bill, which basically it does almost would get us there. If it all passed in one go, it'd probably be the gold standard in Australia. So that's what I'm hopeful for. What the legislation does is it basically copies a lot of what other states and territories have done. So we base our prohibition on LGBTQ conversion practices, the Victorian model, which was a survivor-led model with a focus on mediation and education, but indeed where criminal penalties come in place when there is injury or harm caused. We update our Anti-Discrimination Act with more appropriate and modern language. Currently, the Anti-Discrimination Act only really talks about homosexuals and transsexuals. We talk about sexuality and gender identity as the appropriate concepts that should be protected. We remove the ability for private education authorities to discriminate on the basis of sexuality or gender identity. Currently in New South Wales, if a teacher in a private school enters into a same-sex marriage, theoretically they can be fired. If a kid comes out at high school, theoretically they can be expelled or disciplined. That shouldn't be the case in New South Wales in 2023, and my legislation seeks to address that. It also, we're really grateful for the process that Queensland advocates have done and the Palaszczuk government has done. We just copy their birth certificate law reform, so thank you to the Queenslander there. That made our job very easy, which is the appropriate legislative framework to remove the need for any form of surgical intervention to allow someone to transition sex or gender and update their documents. So we basically adopt the Queensland provisions in the bill. We have some, from working with the Public Service Association, we have some what would be Australian leading provisions in the bill, which provide that in a diversity policy, it has to include LGBTQIA plus diversity, provides provisions for things like gender affirming care leave, and also allows a positive bias to trans and gender diverse people and people with a variation in sex characteristics in the hiring process, knowing that there is just so much discrimination faced by those cohorts. We amend our strip search laws to make it fairer for a person to be able to nominate the sex of the police officer, sheriff, or other person who could be conducting a strip search. You know, many of us have problems with the concept of strip search, but if they do exist, they need to be done in a fair way, particularly for the trans and gender diverse community. So the bill will deal with that. We also take sex work, or as it is in legislation, prostitution, out of the Summary Offences Act. And New South Wales has a really good decriminalised model for sex work, but not in all areas of law. So we remove discrimination where it exists against sex workers in New South Wales legislation.
That's exciting, because that will make us actually first in the world now, won't it? Because we'll have better sex work legislation than New Zealand. Yeah, that's
the hope. And New South Wales already has, if it goes through.
They were neck and neck now. Well, New South Wales was first.
And we also make sure that there is a proper regulated approach to gender affirming care, which is something that the trans advocates and also that the many health practitioners have asked for. So we make it clear that above 16, if a person is GILET competent, they can make their own decisions for their own healthcare appropriately. And we make it clear that under 16, that gender affirming care would be treated just like any other form of healthcare, and the same processes of assessing the individual's competency to make a decision, the need for the approval of just one parent then is in place to provide clarity in law to ensure more people can access gender affirming care. The bill was going to deal with adopting the provisions that the ACT has just put in place around basically a consent framework and a human rights framework around surgeries on infants with intersex variations. But intersex advocates in New South Wales Health needed a bit more time to consult on that. So we've parked that part of the bill, but we'll still progress with it. So the bill does a lot. It updates language in a lot of acts, modernises a lot of things. And I really hope my colleagues are able to have an open heart and open mind to the reform, and we're able to get a lot of it done as soon as possible. The basic premise of the legislation is LGBTQIA plus people exist. So if we exist and you acknowledge we exist, the law should actually protect us and support us and allow us to thrive. So that's the premise of the bill, and that's what it seeks to deliver.
Yes, if we exist, we have rights. We have human rights, and they should be protected in law. And I've noticed that you've been using the A, which I think will make Ash, very happy there. So you're
and we
really
also had that as a
specifically-
protected. We had that as a protected attribute in the Anti-Discrimination Act specifically.
Fantastic. Great, and so that will solve that issue, and we'll be up there with Tasmania as well.
Hopefully, yes.
Should it go through? So let's hope that that's the case. So that's a lot of positive legislative change and recognition occurring. Is there anything that we're missing out on from any of our panellists at the moment? Anything you can think of that, and it can be in your state, in Australia broadly?
I feel like Alex may have just listed out most of them. There's still quite a long way to go, not just in New South Wales, but here in Queensland. We have a number of similar issues. We've seen recent cases in QCAT in relation to vilification laws here in Queensland. We obviously have anti-vilification laws, but the courts are finding it difficult to enforce it on particular behaviour. In layman's terms, it probably doesn't pass the pub test, but it's not being upheld when it goes to court. So even though we do have laws, I think there's areas where we need to look at strengthening those laws, making it a lot clearer as to what is intended by Parliament as good conduct and not acceptable conduct.
So Ash, I guess Tasmania was the last state to decriminalise gay sex. How are we going on other things in Tasmania? And yet the first place to be recognising the A in this way. How else are we going in Tasmania?
Yeah, I think Tasmania's really had a bit of a slow start, but has started leading the way in many aspects. I believe we were the first to have gender reforms where a sex doesn't have to be provided on the birth certificate. I could be wrong on that one, but I believe that we were the first, and we're certainly showing signs of being well on the way to leading the way in many areas. We're currently working on banning, what's the word, conversion practices, and that's something that is actually quite relevant to asexual and aromantic and agender folks as well. So it's a good tie-in. It's a good timing, I suppose, to be working on those two together. But by all means, we're still fighting, and we're still fighting to lead the way.
So amidst this, what looks like legislative progress, if we look not too far away in the United States, we see, a raft of legislation that is being put forward that is specifically trying to contain and control and determine the lives, particularly of young people, to stop trans and gender diverse expressions in a broad range of public spaces. I guess a few years ago it was starting with fights about toilets, but it's become more and more insidious. And I guess, and this ties in a little bit with your work on abortion, how we've seen that with the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the US, discussions about whether marriage equality legislation might be overturned there as well. What are your views on that? Is that something that could happen in the US, and how do we prevent that?
Yeah, look, I think we can never take status quo for granted. And the motivation for me doing the Equality Bill actually came from my mum, who's American, and she didn't like the fact that, the LGBTQI community was always defending ourselves, particularly against religious freedom legislation in the context of the marriage postal survey. So she encouraged me to move forward and and say, these are the reforms that need to happen. So I think as a community and as a movement, we need to always be moving forward. We have to watch what's happening in the US. Some of the language that US campaigners use is starting to be adopted by some of the transphobic campaigners here in Australia, which is dangerous, often dismissed and not given credibility, which is great, but it is starting to sneak in. And I think at the end of the day, what we're seeing I always, as a politician, I believe there are two types of politicians. There are people who seek to empower others, and there are people who seek to use their power to control others. And what we're seeing, particularly in the US, in the gerrymandered districts, in the conservative Republican states, is efforts to control people, to control vulnerable minority groups, to somehow get some political attention out of it. And that's just really, really tragic. That's what is happening. There's also states like obviously California and New York and Washington State where they continue to move forward with great reforms, but it's something we should be mindful of. And I think we just have to, again, go back to that simple premise that LGBTQ people exist, trans people exist. And if trans people exist, which they do, and they have for always, and they will exist into the future, and that is a wonderful, brilliant thing, we just have to make sure that laws are there to protect them and to let them thrive. So it's something that we always have to be consciously aware of, and it is frightening to see what is happening in the US. I mean, bans on drag shows. It's remarkable.
Yeah, and I guess it's not just in the US as well. I maybe made it sound a little bit too simple, but we also have the trans exclusionary radical feminists, which is just such a disappointing movement, isn't it? I mean, it's awful to think of feminism becoming this thing that is defending this turf on dodgy biological grounds instead of trying to, again, embrace the human rights of all and to accept gender categories as being capacious and welcoming.
And you know, like everybody, they're entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts.
That is true.
And this is a cohort of people who do not believe trans people exist. They have, and there are a group of politicians in Australia and the US and the UK who have created the trans community as this boogie monster that we should all be afraid of. The damage that has done to the health and well-being of the trans community and their families is really profound. And it is something that, you know, you talked about what are the outstanding areas of law reform. There's so much that law reform can do. We actually need to make sure that a lot of our LGBT services, particularly mental health services, organisations that look after the trans and gender diverse community, are properly funded and receive recurrent funding. That's something legislation can't do, but it's something that governments must do.
Yeah. Jess, I'd like to throw this one to you, which is something that comes up a lot when we're trying to explain, which is something that we do quite a lot at UNSW in the workshops and, you know, the ally program and things, about how sex and gender sit together and about how these categories work. Essentially, we often talk about sex as if it's a biological category, but in fact, it's a legal category, isn't it? And which is very clearly what your work is showing in terms of changing, you know, passports and things. Can you talk to us about how you go about addressing that when you're talking to people that you're trying to convince? Because I guess in every context that you go into, you're not always speaking with like-minded people.
I think it's the communication, to touch on what Alex said before. There's a lot of misinformation. So a lot of the time it's step one, realigning the information that is fact. Can confirm I'm not a boogeyman. So, you know, step two, talking about what trans and gender diverse lives and families look like. In terms of the use of the word sex, historically through legislation, sex and gender have been characteristics. Gender. Not all. There are some instances where there is legislation that does deal with our bodies, and there is a need in the sense of biological characteristics. For the most part, legislation deals with how we live our lives, gender identity, and that's, I think, the simplistic view of that conversation. To remind people that when I travel overseas, as with everyone else, our biological sex characteristics aren't really important for the country to understand when we enter that country. They need to know our name. Yes, they might need to know our gender and what we look like. And those are all social needs. The medical side of it really is irrelevant for them when it comes to a need to have that conversation.
I think that's really helpful. I really like the way that you use the term sex character to move into the biological sphere and to delineate that, I guess, from gender and I guess also from sex as a legal where it probably should be gender, but actually changing that over to, maybe it'll be next decade's job. I'd like to invite people in the audience, if there is anybody here who has any pressing questions that they'd like to ask, to feel free to raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over. We also have our people who are online at the moment, and I'm just checking in with Izzy, is keeping an eye on what we have down there. Izzy, do you have any questions from our online friends?
We haven't had any come through yet, but anyone in the room or online is welcome to go to slido.com, SLIDO.com, and enter 3057452. The 3057452 to ask any questions, and anyone in the room.
Oh, fantastic. We'll start with Claire down there and then we'll go up here. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
This is a really, really interesting discussion. I'm just curious to know what's going on in the rest of Australia, because we've had a lot of information about what's going on in Queensland and New South Wales, and Tasmania. But yeah, just wondering if the rest of the states are kind of keeping up, or if there are some that have got a significant way to go. Yeah, just wondered what's going on in the rest of the country.
Alex, you're probably the person best able to answer that.
Yeah, look, I think Victoria has gone a long way on a lot of important legislation, particularly their prohibition on conversion practices and the way in which they support and fund LGBTI organisations and some of their anti-discrimination protections. Of course, Victoria also has a Human Rights Act, which helps, which helps as a basis for potential legal challenges within that state. WA still has not started a process when it comes to a prohibition on conversion practices, I believe. But the prohibition in that has passed in Victoria. Queensland needs to do a bit more work. They have a very much of a health focus when it comes to conversion practices, with the experience in Victoria and New South Wales. Our legislation will deal with the more subversive approaches. Obviously, the ACT has led the way with reforms to prohibit and put a framework around surgeries on infants with intersex variations. New South Wales and Victoria are both consulting on how to do that. And then one of the things which has kind of held back a lot of law reform has been the hot potato of religious freedoms legislation, which is trying to use the Sex Discrimination Act or state anti-discrimination acts. You know, the proposal from some is to use those acts to protect the ability for churches or religiously run organisations to discriminate against people rather than protect people from discrimination. So that tension is something that exists, I think, in every state and territory still.
Just go to this questioner here, thank you.
Thank you. It's very inspiring to hear about progressing and forward. My question is, as a proud cis gay man who lives in Western Sydney, I think a lot about the fallout from marriage equality, and I was actually living in the inner west during that period and have recently moved back to finish my studies. I am interested to know if that specific fallout from the marriage equality, I find it very difficult being where I grew up and being surrounded by the statistics that unfortunately have really negatively impacted my mental health and ability to just exist day to day, I think, as I did before marriage equality happened. And I guess my question is that something that's also being considered, the impact to queer people beyond the marriage equality campaign that obviously negatively affects us all?
Absolutely, and we know that sort of the bulk of the seats where we didn't quite get to a majority for yes, a lot of them were in Western Sydney. There has been some really good work being done by ACON and other LGBTI orgs to empower and support communities within Western Sydney in particular. that there's been some good work that's been done with multiculturalism in New South Wales as well. And we obviously need to make sure that the services and supports are properly funded in there. We also need to make sure that we've got a legislative framework that doesn't allow some of the religiously affiliated organisations to practice their discrimination, to engage in conversion practices. So that's a lot of the work that's going on there. I think it's important to remember with the marriage postal survey, this was not something that came from the LGBTI community or came from marriage equality advocates. It was imposed on us as a threat from the Abbott government that then Turnbull adopted, and it happened, and it happened in a really painful way for a lot of people. And when I think of that process, I know it's kind of changing topics a bit, but I really think of a lot and know that we need to put in place proper resources and support for a lot of our First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Because just as we went through a pretty horrific time when our dignity was put on the ballot paper, they're going through a process. And I feel really almost, I don't think I should feel guilty, but I sort of feel guilty that we comparatively to what First Nations people are going through at the moment, the targeted misinformation, the deep-seated racism that they're dealing with on every single day, the no side, which is the same people as it was in our campaign, they've sharpened their tools. They've practiced their misinformation campaigns. They've adopted tricks from the US and they're continuing to do damage. And I think there probably needs, if we are going to be having more public votes where there are minority groups impacted by them, we really need to do a lot better to make sure there are the supports in place for those communities, and particularly those vulnerable communities. And obviously I will use every forum and platform I have to encourage everybody to vote yes for a First Nations voice to Parliament and constitutional recognition. That's something that just ultimately the marriage equality vote moved us forward as a fairer and more equal place. And the yes vote on the 14th of October, I believe, will do exactly the same thing.
And thank you for bringing that up. I think that you've spoken for many of us in voicing that pain, and I understand how, coming from those communities, feeling like you have people around you. I must say that as a lesbian mother, when John Howard made that comment about, remember there was something about the two mums on Play School, where I was the mother of a small child at that time, and I remember suddenly having that feeling that perhaps I lived in a community where people hated me, and actually really quickly, and that my child was going to suffer from that. And really quickly I realised that I was still in Newtown and it was okay, but we don't all have that luxury, not all the time, sadly. And so thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for talking about the need resources and the need particularly for governments to recognise the role that community organisations play in supporting people through this. I mean, this is something, had we not had that process, you wouldn't experience that had it just been legislated because it's the right thing. But Ash, I'm hoping to turn to you to talk about what has your experience been since actually having the A recognised? Has that actually galvanised your communities? Has there been a response for you, a kind of a response that you felt in Tasmania?
So as part of the campaign that we did, we spoke with almost 300 people from the broader LGBTQIA+ community, and that was really about gauging their response and gauging their support for including the A, but also raising awareness, because asexual, aromantic and agender folks are still very poorly understood. A lot of people don't know what A actually stands for. A lot of people think that A stands for allies, which is allies are an important group, but don't necessarily need recognition in the acronym when there's people who are still marginalised, still experiencing discrimination based on an identity that they don't get to choose. So really talking to people about that, and talking to people about what aromantic and agender and asexual folks are was key to that campaign. Sorry, I just got distracted. So through that, we gauged a lot of community support. Overwhelmingly, people said yes, they do think that agender, aromantic and asexual people should be included in the acronym. And that was really the basis through which we could then go to the government and say, you know, these are the challenges that our community face. The broader LGBTQIA+ community want us included. They want to see us officially included and recognised. And that's what got us over the line. In terms of broader recognition, we had a really great media response to the changes, and that wasn't by accident. Rodney Croom was on the phone practically on the way to the airport to fly internationally organising that, so he did a really fantastic job, and it really helped raise that profile and get awareness out there. So I think that the awareness is definitely up. It is noticeable, and you know, I've had a lot of people in my life who have personally come to me and spoken to me about my experiences, which is really huge. Also quite daunting. It is still, asexuality and aromanticism particularly are still very much misunderstood and misrepresented, so it can be a really challenging conversations to have with people. And like everyone, you know, in the LGBTQIA+ community has gone through, constantly educating everybody you meet about who you are, it takes its toll, but it's important work that has to be done if we want to be recognised and accepted. So yeah, I think that's a very roundabout answer to your question.
That's terrific. Thanks, Ash. Alex, you've talked about how the marriage equality campaign aligns in some ways with the Voice campaign. I'm really interested to ask you about your on the decriminalisation of abortion, because I think many of us of the feminist persuasion were so excited to see a young gay man leading the charge here, recognising that our sexual and reproductive rights, both as LGBTIQ+ people and as people who might have accidental or unplanned or unwanted abortions, that they are connected. What kind of response did you get in the community to your advocacy and your leadership there?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people were actually shocked that reproductive health care it's still regulated in the Crimes Act in New South Wales and relied on a court decision. And obviously there's been a strong alignment between the LGBTQIA+ community and feminist movement over many years, with, you know, many feminists marching in the Mardi Gras in 1978. And also, again, you know, also the same sort of opponents, right? Yes. The big end of church using their power to seek to impose their own moral judgments on everybody else. So I think but having gone through the marriage equality campaign for a decade, I was kind of well versed to know how to take them on. And ultimately we were successful in that. But, you know, my job in that was to usher the legislation through the Parliament. This had been the life's work of so many amazing feminists for a very long time, and it was an honour to work with them, and it was an honour to work with all my colleagues, people like Penny Sharp in the Legislative Council, who had carriage of the bill up there, to see it done and to see it achieved. It was a tough political process, but we got there.
Yeah, thank you. It was, you know, it was marvellous to finally see it change, because I think people were first saying, no, it's time to change this now, in about 1971. And it took a very long time. And
it took a parliament with a female premier, a female leader of the opposition, a female speaker, and a female governor. So if we still had criminalised abortion in that setting, you know, what kind of place are we? So it was really good to get done.
Yeah, well, thank you for your work on that. I'm going to throw to Izzy down the back, who has some questions from our people online.
Hello. I have a question from online. How do wins in the states regarding A in the acronym and affirmed gender on birth certificates in Queensland relate to other needs for other stigmatised such as sex work, drugs, or to the trickle-down effects?
Well, look, I think that when we are looking at anti-discrimination legislation, we need to make sure that there are all-encompassing protections, and those include for sex work and sex workers. My proposed legislation seeks to do that. We need to make sure that we're addressing any intersectional discrimination amongst, say, a trans person who is also a sex worker, and make sure that there are that protections are in place that are all-encompassing of that. And again, when it comes to sex workers and access to healthcare, or drug users and access to healthcare, there's some stuff that legislation can do, but there's a lot of stuff that policy and funding can do as well. So they are sort of linked, but they're sort of not.
Great, thank you for that. I think we have another one at the back there.
Yes, from online, what advice do the panel have for young people wanting to get involved in LGBTQIA+ rights? Should you pursue professional routes, take up personal activism?
Great question.
I'm happy to jump in because I love the answer to this one, and I think it's find something you're passionate about. Find something that you are truly passionate about that impacts you, your friends, your family, that you can speak to, you have a lived experience or know someone who has a lived experience, because it's tough. Advocacy work is tough. As Alex said, learning how to fight the fight. When it's something that is close to home, you'll fight a lot harder and you won't give up when you're knocked down. Whether that is through formal groups or attending rallies and marches, I think every little bit helps. So yeah, if it's starting out, find something that you're passionate about and get involved with that. You'll learn more, and it'll open up the opportunities to more advocacy work because there's plenty to do.
Anyone else like to comment? Ash?
Yeah, I'll second everything that Jessica's just said, and add, I think just taking a step, it doesn't matter what the step is, taking a step, and I think that you'll find that many more opportunities will just unfold right before you from that first step. You don't need to know what your ultimate goal is, because the pathway will sort of illuminate itself one step at a time. So I think it can be overwhelming to think of all the changes that need to happen, because there are a lot of changes that need to happen. But every change starts with one step from one person, and then they bring a friend along on that step, and then suddenly it's a movement.
Thanks. Alex, anything to add?
I would just say don't ask for permission. Don't wait for someone to reach out to you to ask for help. There are so many ways that we can all work to make Australia a fairer and more equal place for the LGBTQIA+ community. It could be, a union you're a member of and be part of their pride or their advisory council, which trickles down into recommending government legislation. It could be in a workplace. You could join the diversity and inclusion group and help to make your workplace a safer place for LGBTQIA+ people. I'm an independent, but you can also join a political party. They all need a lot of help, and they need the support of people who are passionate in this area. And don't think you need to be, the person who's drafting the legislation to be the person that makes an impact. I've done everything from letterboxing to stuffing envelopes, to media wrangling, to drafting submissions for people, editing documents. There's so many ways in which you can help, and we all have access to different mechanisms, different groupings, different professional, educational, workplace, community organisations to be able to help out and make a difference. And it's so important to do so.
And also at UNSW, there are various avenues for people who are wanting to start out. So through the Ally program, getting your training there, possibly being one of the lived experience speakers. There are ways that you can start to practice talking about yourself and about your communities, getting involved, meeting other people, gaining confidence, learning about how all of those networks work, and going from there. There are lots of different avenues. We do have some more questions up the back from our many online people.
I have another question from online. If anyone in the room has a question, please, and I'll bring it to you. This is a question for Jess. In your career, how do you balance the visibility of your activism, often horrific violence, and diverse people?
Can you ask that question again? Sorry, I missed the first bit.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, in your career, how do you balance the visibility of your activism with what is often horrific violence against trans and gender diverse people?
I think with a lot of care and attention, unfortunately, it is something that takes up a lot of energy, and it's hard putting yourself out there and talking about your lived experience. Particularly this year, I know through the work we do through the LGBTQIA legal service, we saw an increase in calls, whether that be for discrimination and harassment. Anytime there's discussion in the public, groups march on state parliament steps, for example, certain TERFs like to fly into the country, it brings attention to an issue, the media write about it, and that's for my community. I honestly don't know the answer to that, how I balance it. It's just a difficult balancing act. I just simply can't live with the fact that being invisible means our lives don't exist, and sitting down and getting on with my life doesn't help anyone else. And the next generation, we still know there's plenty of work to do, not just in my community, but across the broad range of marginalised communities that live within this country. So I think personally, if there's anything that I can do to assist those people, make their lives better, my life a little bit easier, then I'm happy to put myself out there. And sometimes I don't see it as a risk so much, but perhaps that's also some of the privilege that I live with as well.
Thanks, Jess. We've got a question down in the middle here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the practical tips of how we can all get involved in advocacy. I also wanted to kind of just bring up the topic about the referendum as well, and ask about any other similarities you see with the same-sex marriage plebiscite campaign, as well as with the upcoming referendum, and what are some lessons learned that we can apply to that?
I mean, obviously they are different prospects we're dealing with. One is long overdue constitutional recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and obviously a voice to Parliament. The process is a referendum. Ours was a voluntary postal survey that we didn't actually need to get a result to ultimately have law reform. But the similarities both are national public votes. The similarity, again, one of the similarities is the opponents are the same. There are arch conservatives who are targeting minority groups. A minority group happens to be our First Nations people, what previously was the LGBTI community, for their own political ends and purposes, which is just disgraceful in my opinion. But they use informations of misinformation and confusion and just throw everything at it. We're seeing a really, in my view, a much more appalling engagement from the leader of the coalition. You know, Malcolm Turnbull was the Prime Minister at the time and leader of the coalition. He was a supporter of marriage equality. That obviously helped. Obviously, Peter Dutton is using the Voice referendum for his own political ends and purposes. So that's kind of the bad stuff. The good stuff is, you know, rarely do we have a vote where we're actually able to have a meaningful impact on other people's lives. By voting yes in the marriage equality postal survey, we knew we were having a meaningful impact on removing some discrimination against the LGBTQIA community and making sure a person can marry the person they love in the country they love. With the referendum on the 14th of October, we know we're having a positive impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We're recognising them as First Nations people in the Constitution. That's the honest thing to do. And we are also putting in place a mechanism to help inform government legislation in the voice to Parliament. Parliament, state and federal, have failed to close the gap. And it's time that we had a mechanism to be able to hear directly from First Nations people on reforms that are important to them. So I guess the similarity is also the opportunity to participate in a public vote where you can have a positive outcome by voting yes again. And I really think both are in line with Australia's values of fairness and equality. Australians are fair-minded people. We do think everybody should be treated equally, and we're pretty honest people as well. Those are really the values that are reflected in the proposition that will be put to us on the 14th of October. It's going to be a hard slog. I think the campaign is doing an amazing job, though. I was there on yesterday at the march from Redfern Park through to Victoria Park. And we know that we're a part of like 200,000 people marching across the country. We also had that same energy in the marriage equality postal survey, where we had these big days of activation. I was actually looking at a photo, 5 years ago, I was with Sarah Hanson-Young, Penny Wong, and Christopher Pyne, all coming together for marriage equality. Today, I was with Barry O'Farrell, Matt Keane, Sarah Hanson-Young, Penny Sharp, all coming together for The Voice. So I think that there's also opportunities for people from across the political spectrum to come together and campaign for something really positive.
It's also been very rewarding to actually see UNSW taking a position on this, because they didn't on marriage equality, to the chagrin of many of us who were involved here. So it's fantastic. It feels like there's been moral progress from seeing an institution coming forward, and obviously this being the institution that the wonderful Megan Davis comes from, actually, supporting the incredible work that she's done. I think we have another question up the back there.
We do have another question from online, and this one is for Ash. Ash, how do you feel about such a win for Tassie in the agender, asexual and romantic space, when the state used to be so behind historically? What is it like down there? How is your community, and do you feel supported?
Yeah, it's a great question. The win's really exciting, and it is evidence towards the fact that Tassie isn't the sort of behind little country island that it used to be seen as. We're really progressing things along. I think like anywhere, there are still areas and regions that are less progressive, and where people across the LGBTQIA+ community experience a lot more discrimination and active overt or covert aggression, which is sad, but a truth that I think we're all aware of and are working towards fixing. But I think that every step we take in the right direction is a great step, and I think a win for anyone in the community is a win for the whole community. I think solidarity is really key. Where by definition minority groups are in a minority, so we need to stand together to be heard. So I think any win for the community is a win for the whole community.
Thanks very much, Ash. I think we have another one from the online people.
This is a question for all of the panel members. How can research support the legislative change or act, and how do you use it in your work?
I might jump in on that one if that's all right, because there is a huge dearth in research around the asexual, agender and aromantic communities. And that was a struggle that we really was really noticeable when we were looking for evidence to support our case. It just wasn't there. So I think that research is really important. It's really important to consider which voices aren't currently reflected in the research, and ask yourself why that might be, because chances are it's because they're the most marginalised, the most erased groups, and those groups that most need research in order to further their position and get that recognition on the most basic level. Like, you know, we're talking about recognition in the Constitution for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and recognition is really it's the lowest rung on the ladder, and yet, you know, groups don't have it. There are groups that don't have it.
Thanks, Ash. Jess, would you like to have a go?
Yeah, I'll add something here in Queensland that the LGBTI legal service is working on, certainly looking for funding. The issues in this area is always funding. It unfortunately takes hours, lots of hours to go through and do the research. One of the projects we've got on the go, and we're looking to get off with a lot of pro bono hours through our law firm partners, is a research project in the areas of the law where there are gaps. So we often have, as I said before, laws in relation to anti-discrimination and anti-vilification and other laws that deal with the broad spectrum of LGBTIQA plus people, but the laws let those people down. And so one of the areas that we're looking for a lot of research, we don't know where to put our time and resources in terms of law reform, is because we don't know where those areas are. And so research is really important to identify where those gaps are, and to tell the real story of people's lives and where the law is letting them down, to allow us to better use the limited resources we've got, like most organisations, when it comes to law reform or any advocacy work, is sort of where to hone in that focus and ensure that we're not wasting time, effort, money on areas that don't need the most attention. So it plays a vital role in helping us direct our time and effort into areas. Without the research, we simply don't know what is happening in the lives of people.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jess. Alex, how about you?
Look, you know, two or three pieces of research were the precursors for my LGBTQIA plus equality bill. In working with the former Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, New South Wales Health developed the LGBTQIA plus health strategy for New South Wales, which did research and looked into the health outcomes of the community, and what were the things that were causing poor health outcomes, including stigma and discrimination. What were the laws that were creating barriers? So to have New South Wales Health produce a health strategy document based on their research and resources of New South Wales was obviously a huge piece of evidence and research I was able to use in formulating my bill. The Advocate for Children and Young People did also a research piece on the experience of young LGBTQIA plus people, their access to healthcare, their experiences with bullying and harassment. Was able to have some really concrete findings and recommendations, which again helped to inform the bill which I've done. And obviously that big piece of work that Equality Australia did in terms of looking through 500 odd plus pieces of legislation in New South Wales to make recommendations to me on how to remove that was hugely helpful. And you know, I think we need research and we need evidence. And the good news about the good news and the bad news about progressing with LGBTI law reform, the evidence is quite clearly there that work needs to be done to remove stigma and discrimination in laws. The evidence is on our side. The bad part is that stigma and discrimination that our community feels is having very negative and poor health and mental health consequences.
Yeah. Do we have another question off the back there?
Just a reminder to anyone in the room as well that they can ask questions at slido.com. You can use the code 305 7 questions. I have a bit of a follow-up question from online for Ash. Ash, could you tell us more about the kind of research that would be beneficial for supporting agender, asexual and a?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the reason why recognition in the acronym is a really important first step is because a lot of even basic research that is focused on LGBTIQ folks doesn't specifically report on the A, doesn't specifically ask or report on people who are asexual, aromantic and agender. So even the information that we have out there that's supposed to be, you know, painting the picture of our community isn't painting the whole picture. It's sort of leaving some people out of the frame. So I think that from a very basic perspective, if you're doing the research, ask the question and think about how it can be made meaningful and made to draw out the experiences of asexual and aromantic and agender folks. You know, specific research is great, and we're certainly looking to conduct some specific research into the experiences of asexual, agender and aromantic folks. But I guess that's another step. First step, just include us. Just include us when you ask about, you know, sexuality, sexual identities and gender identities. Just include us. It's not. It's that simple.
Thanks, Ash. Picking up on the point that you just raised a moment ago, Alex, about bullying, it made me think about how we've had these legislative gains and hopefully about to have another one, and yet in recent years we really, particularly in New South Wales, lost the whole Safe Schools program, which was, you know, specifically about, you know, bullying and harassment of young people in the place where they are required by law to be. What's your take on that? How did that become such a disaster?
Look, there were certain people on the arch conservative side of politics who jumped on it. They imported talking points from the US and created this myth that we were teaching homosexuality or we were teaching radical gender theory in schools. And, you know, there was a clear dog whistle that somehow kids are being groomed in schools in New South Wales because we were targeting bullying against the LGBTI community. So unfortunately, you know, there was a political response to that. The Safe Schools program got defunded. But that said, New South Wales Education has done a great deal of work to make sure that New South Wales schools, public schools, are supportive and welcoming and don't tolerate discrimination or bullying as much as they can against LGBTQIA plus students. Some private schools have done really great work in this space too. Some religious schools have done really great work in this space, but there's more that needs to happen. I think the community's tolerance for discrimination against the LGBTQIA plus community, whether it's bullying, harassment, is very low, and expectations from parents and communities are that schools take it seriously and do what they can to support LGBTQIA plus students.
We've kind of gone stealth on it, but things are still happening.
Yes, absolutely.
That's great to hear. I think we have another question off the back there.
This is a question for Jess. A recent Australian report with trans people showed that 1 in 2 trans people have experienced hatred in the last 12 months. Beyond anti-discrimination mechanisms, what social changes do we need to see to reduce this?
Gosh, how long have we got? We could touch on the change to media laws. We could touch on even parliamentary rules in some states or federal chambers. I think there's a whole host of poor behaviour that is let slip and people don't have to account. And I think the organisers have just said, go nuts, Jess, take as long as you like. We will be here all night. There's a whole host of changes that could be made. The statistics correct. I could certainly speak from lived experience on that. And it comes from a whole host of places in all of our organisations, in our workplaces, in the media, in Parliament, really to drive that social change.
Thanks, Jess. I think we have another question off the back here.
From online, this is actually a question for you, Bridget. As a researcher, what can we all do here at UNSW to ensure that voices and experiences of people like Ash, Jess, and even Alex can be meaningfully included in the research that we do?
I think the most important thing in terms of the meaningful inclusion of any particular population, but particularly people across the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, is to make sure, umbrella, is to make sure that we work in a consultative fashion. That we don't assume, I mean, I'm a queer woman, but I don't know everything about queer women. If I'm going to do research on queer women, I need an advisory group. I need an advisory group of people who have a whole range of different lived experiences to help. And I think all of us need that. When we're going into working with marginalised populations, you can't assume that you know it. You can't assume that you know it from the literature, because the literature is always going to be, at the very least 9 months behind it. At the moment with COVID, I think even more so than that. You need people who are on the ground, living and working in the communities, and who bring their lived experience to your research project. So I think there's no excuse not to partner. I think partnering is absolutely critically important, and to be able to partner, researchers have to behave well. That means that you have to do what you say that you're going to do. You have to report back to communities. You have to be responsible, and you have to take every element of the research integrity really, really seriously. But I do think that most important step is having the right partnerships in place so that your research is supported by the people, so that you're not researching on people, that you're researching with people, and that you research the value of respect goes through every part of it. So I hope that's enough of an answer. It's a great question. Thank you. Even though I'm not a panelist. So we're now moving of the evening. I would like, as a final closing point, to ask each speaker to tell us one thing that we collectively need to do to support LGBTQIA plus rights in 23. One thing that you would like the audience here to walk away with, or the audience online to be able to hang up and have their dinner, or actually they can have their dinner. We have to wait for ours. Or hang up and do whatever thing it is that they do when they stop being online. And how can the audience get involved? What would that one thing be for you?
I would say to call out LGBTQIA plus discrimination, homophobia and transphobia when you see it. Use that as an opportunity to engage and educate people where possible. Use that as an opportunity to provide care, comfort and support to people experiencing those attacks which happen in society.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Jess, how about you?
Mine would be a little less specific, I think a bit more broader, because change doesn't just happen, and it's not just around the corner. I think generations, if we go back generations, where people will be telling you it's just around the corner, and we now know it's not. It takes a lot of time. We know that things have progressed though, because they aren't how they were generations ago. But we also know governments don't just evolve and laws don't just change, and that progression is not guaranteed. So I think more broadly, to consider that every little bit of change needs an advocate, campaigns and community that gets behind it, and you're part of that community. For every law that's protected marginalised groups or children or women, it's been fought by people. And for every person who's successfully advocated for some change, there's generations who have lived not to see that day. So whatever that change looks like for you, and whatever you're passionate about, and whatever change you want to advocate for, and the better world that we all want to live in, it won't just happen one day, it will happen with you. So get out there and get involved.
Thank you for that, Jess. Ash?
I think I'd say stand up and stand together. I think as far as I can see, the progress of various different groups within the LGBTQIA community and their advancement, it follows the same trajectory. It's exactly the same fight. Each group's at a different stage in that fight, but we all follow along the same path. We're all in the same boat, and we need to recognise that we're all the same and we can help each other. We can help each other advance, but we can always support each other because it's not an easy work that we do. And as much as we need help to actually do the work, we also need people standing next to us after it's all done, whether we've had success or whether it hasn't gone the way we wanted. We need solidarity with other people who have been in that fight.
Thank you, Ash, for saying that. That is such an important point. And yeah, we do all need each other, and we need that connection to enable those people who are able to be warriors need that support, I think, to keep them going. So I would like now to thank each and every one of you who has made the effort to be here tonight, whether you were here in person or whether you were here online. We have loved having you here, listening to the fantastic questions, hearing your engagement, and I feel like we can feel the excitement and the empathy going through all of those questions that were asked. I'd like to thank the Diversity Fest for hosting us here. It's been very, very exciting for our community of practice to have our very first event. I'd like to let you know, those of you from UNSW, well, which is all of you, well, pretty much all of you, that there are many more amazing events in the Diversity Fest lineup. Additionally, between this week and next week, UNSW is holding its annual Sextember with more queer events. Between the 25th and the 27th of September, we have the Sex, Health and Society Conference on the evening of Tuesday the 26th. We have a free interactive workshop, which is again held by our community of practice, which is focused on making research more inclusive of gender and sexuality diversity. And that is specifically being run. All of our speakers are in fact HDR students from UNSW, and we're very, very excited with bringing the voice of fresh young people into the workshop. It involves an amazing panel. They're all PhD candidates who are thinking deeply and critically about how to do accurate and meaningful research that can benefit our communities across health and justice. We would like to encourage all of you who are here tonight, either in person or online, to try to stay engaged with our community of practice. We would love to hear from you. We would love to hear about what kinds of events you'd like to go to, the timing of those events, the ways that you would like to interact with us. We'd love to know what you think about this panel event. I think it's been fantastic, but I might be biased. And I'd like to, I'm going to read you out a link. Does anybody ever actually manage to remember a link when it's read out? Let's give it a go. It's edi.unsw.edu.au/CopQTI, which is COPQTI. That's how you get through to the web page for this community of practice. We would love to hear from you. Probably if you just Google EDI and community of practice, I reckon you'll get there that way too. That's always the way that I find, being a little bit elderly these days and my memory being not quite as keen as it was. But I would like to thank you all for being here, and let's have a round of applause for our amazing panelists. I think we need to recognise their passion, their advocacy, endless hard work, and recognition, as Alex said, that hard work usually goes down from level of stuff being, you're wearing out your shoes, to the more glamorous, high-level stuff that I speak of around the world. So thank you, three of you, for doing the work. I hope that you all diversity. Thank you. Could we also acknowledge our diversity down the back there who are finding the questions and fielding? I think they need a big round of applause as well. And one day the air conditioning. But isn't it nice to be? Thank you and good night.